Good evening and welcome to this session of the York Festival of Ideas. My name is John Robinson. I'm an emeritus professor here and a huge Beatles fan. So we're delighted this evening to have with us Ian Leslie. Ian has produced a number of works in different media for the radio, in books. In particular, he has what's almost a trilogy of books on deception, disagreement, and curiosity. And now he's produced John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs. So a bit of a move, and this evening we're going to be discussing this. The format will be roughly 35 minutes where we are in conversation, which is basically an interview, I think. And then we have about 20 minutes for audience questions. So I think, we'll get started. So Ian, welcome to York.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us today. Can you begin by telling us a little bit about what led you from your previous work to take on this book?
Yes, so my previous books have been, broadly speaking, in the area of ideas and psychology and human nature, human behavior. And I was in between books. This is kind of 2020, I think. I had a book just about to come out. Didn't know what I was going to write about next. And because I had quite a lot of time on my hands that year, as some of you did too, I decided to do one of those projects that you kind of have in your mind and never get around to doing. Mine was, I need to write a very long essay about why Paul McCartney is good at music. It wasn't quite that. It was more why I still think he's underrated. And I wrote it, self-published it on my Substack, and really it was just a thing that I needed to do to kind of get off my chest. I didn't really expect many people to read it, but it went completely viral. That's probably the wrong word to use in the context of 2020, but lots of people read it, and lots of people were very moved by it, and there was a very strong response to it. And at that point, I started to think, wow, maybe I could write about the Beatles. I mean, I've been fascinated, and I've loved the Beatles, the music, and the people in the story ever since I was a kid. Never thought I could write a book about them because I'm not a music writer, and there are obviously many, many books about the Beatles, as I'm reminded by everybody that talks to me about the book. So it hadn't really kind of like seemed like a feasible possibility, but the success of that essay, the unexpected kind of virality of that essay, made me think maybe I could do it. And then once I thought about what I wanted to write, it was very, very quickly apparent to me that I wanted to write about Lennon and McCartney and the relationship between the two. In fact, when I was writing the McCartney piece, I already had to cut out a lot of that material because it was turning into a whole nother kind of monster. Well, this is the monster, really.
We'll mainly go chronologically through the history of the Beatles, but you begin the book in 1980, and maybe you could just outline that incident and why you chose to start there.
Well, yeah, so I begin very briefly with the interview with Paul McCartney, quite famous now, where he, in 24 hours after John Lennon is murdered, and he comes out of a building, microphones are shoved into his face, and they say, what do you think about this? And his response is very brusque, very matter-of-fact, unemotional. And then he ends by saying, yeah, it's a drag, isn't it? And he gets into his car. And this is a kind of seminal moment, really, because it confirmed what many people suspected already, or it seemed to, which was that Lennon and McCartney didn't like each other, hated each other by this stage. And that McCartney was this essentially quite emotionally shallow, weird, musically talented but superficial guy, and Lennon was the great, deep, creative kind of genius of the Beatles, And as a prominent American music writer put it, they shot the wrong Beatle. Basically, that's basically what he said. And McCartney's reputation went down, and Lennon's kind of went up. It was already in the ascendant, but it was... So I just thought we'd start there, because I think when you get back to the end of the story, and we end around the same, after John's death, you see things very differently, and you have a greater understanding of both McCartney's response to it, and also a much deeper understanding of where the relationship was and how it was formed and everything else.
So let's go back to the beginning. One of the lovely things about the book is that each chapter is it's not really structured around, but each chapter references a song. Most of them Lennon and McCartney songs. But the first chapter references Come Go With Me. And maybe that's a good place to start. Many people are familiar with Paul and John meeting in 1957. The Quarrymen, John's group singing at an event, Paul going along and then showing what he could do. But then you sort of talk about how that youthful relationship develops. And I think you use that song in an interesting way. Is that something you could say something about?
Yeah, Come Go With Me is the song that John is playing with his skiffle group at Wilton Fete, at Wilton Church. When McCartney sets eyes on him and then later on meets him properly for the first time. And, it's a gift that you have to be singing Come Go With Me. I could hardly call the chapter anything else, right? And it's not a meeting of equals. So Lennon already has a local reputation. He's older than Paul, and not much, but a kind of year and a bit, which when you're an adolescent boy, that's a very long time, it's a generation. And he was charismatic, he looked amazing, he was a teddy boy, renowned for his kind of wit and his sense of humour, and for being quite tough to be around. But McCartney knew he could bring something to Lennon if he wanted to as well. And he knew that he was really good at the guitar and he could sing. And so there's this kind of interesting tension where McCartney, who's introduced to Lennon by a mutual friend, wants to impress John because he thinks, this guy clearly looks like he could be a rock and roll star. Maybe we could do something together. But I'm going to have to impress him. And at the same time, McCartney's, I think, very confident already by this stage and is thinking, well, let's see what he's got as well. And Lennon is thinking, well, this has been my group, and Lennon liked to dominate any group that he was in. He was a very kind of domineering alpha male personality in some ways, but in some ways not. And he recognized, once he heard Paul play and he watched him and he thought, my God, yeah, he looks like he could be a pop star. He recognized that if he was going to let Paul in, it wasn't just going to be John and another group of backing singers, of which Paul was one. It was going to be John and Paul.
So then we come on to the long apprenticeship of the Beatles. Of course, George joined not long after that, brought in by Paul, a younger boy still. But then the Ringo story is very late in the apprenticeship. That only happens towards the end. So these next few years playing in clubs in Liverpool and then the gigs in Hamburg and so on. How does the Lennon-McCartney relationship develop in terms, I guess, musically, but also in terms of the...
Yeah, well, that's the fascinating thing about it, and really the kind of thread of the book is that it develops musically and personally in tandem, right? So they get to know each other and they form a kind of intimacy through songs and singing and songwriting, talking and doing music. And that becomes really the kind of, not just the shared interest, but a kind of channel of communication between them. So pretty soon after they start playing in the group together, they start getting together at each other's homes with their guitars and singing together. and playing songs that they both know, and also writing songs, which now seems kind of obvious. Yeah, we know they wrote songs together, but we have to kind of take a step back and go, well, that's quite extraordinary that they were doing that at all. You know, according to Mark Lewison, I'm sure lots of you have read Lewison's work. He's a kind of foremost historian of the Beatles, really. He says it was very rare for teenage boys in England to be writing songs. So there were quite a few kind of rock and roll nuts, right? Playing the guitar, learning the guitar, playing songs from the radio. But very few seem to take that next step, which was, I'm going to write these songs. I'm going to try my hand at this myself, right? Now, it's hard to say exactly why, but I would guess it was just this huge kind of cultural barrier, this sense that this is American music. And it's American black music, you know, and I'm a white kid from, south of Liverpool or South London or wherever. Of course, I'm not going to try and make this music myself. I can just sort of play it and have fun with it. And John and Paul together leap that hurdle. So that's kind of number one. Number two is the other kind of important thing that's going on here is that these are two. I think emotionally intense young men by their natures who also have pretty terrible things happen to them around the same... Well, they both have bereavements, right? And they both lose their mothers. And John, in particular, even before he loses his mother, has a series of incredibly disruptive and painful events to deal with in his childhood, right? And they're also in adolescence, which is the most emotionally intense period of a life, really, and their personalities are kind of fluid and forming and so on. We've been talking in this country recently, haven't we, about young boys and about boys and young men and what they do with all these feelings. And the question applied just as much and even more so. You know, they didn't even have the idea that you might have counselling or go to therapy or you might want to talk about your emotions. It just wasn't a thing. So lucky for them and lucky for us, these two find a way to process all this incredible amount of emotion. They find the pop song, and the song becomes a vessel into which they can pour all these different emotions. Because pop songs seem, they might have seemed simple. I love you, you love me, baby, but they're full of complex emotions, right? In the music and the sound of the voices and the whole atmosphere of a track, and as well as the words, there's love and desire and jealousy and loneliness and resentment and all these things. And so the song becomes this kind of emotional panic room for these two guys, and they discover it and shape it and start making them together, and the thing that's absolutely formative to their relationship, right? So really they live their lives through pop. They live their emotional lives, or a large part of their emotional lives is through pop songs, including their emotions about each other. And right from the beginning, I think they're starting to pour their kind of feelings about each other into the song. So there's a kind of dialogue going on as well. It's a long answer, but this I do think is kind of so formative, this stage, because the other thing that's happening, of course, is that they decide that this is a Lennon and McCartney songwriting partnership, which again is quite a kind of visionary and an odd thing to do in a way, because there weren't many models for this partnership. They might have seen Lieber and Stoller on the single, on an Elvis single. They knew about Rodgers and Hart, Rodgers and Hammerstein, this kind of classic American partnerships, but they're very different, right? I mean, nobody wanted to see Rodgers and Hart on stage, and nobody knew what Lieber and Stoller sounded like when they were playing guitar, So the idea that you would sing and write your own songs, and there were examples of that, but in terms of songwriting partnerships, it was quite unusual. And the other unusual thing about it was that there was no division of labour. All these songwriting partnerships, both before and after Lennon and McCartney, there's almost always a division of labour between words and music. There's the words guy, there's the music guy. Both of them did words, both of them did music. So I just wanted to kind of take a moment there to just kind of stress how important that early couple of years was, and also how unusual it was right from the beginning, and then you see this all the way through the Beatles' career. They're kind of having to invent their own models of what we're doing. They're not copying other people. They're kind of creating new ways to be.
I wonder if we can come back to that question of how they interacted in their songs later on. I'm just aware that time is moving on, but the chronology of the Beatles isn't moving on so fast. So I think if we leap ahead to really the time when they started interacting with the adults, I guess, who were just a few years older than them. So Brian Epstein hears them in the cavern and writes memorably about that experience. They have a failed Decca audition, and then they have the audition with George Martin. And what's quite odd when you read the story is that George Martin actually contemplated that there could be a frontman, because that's what all groups had, and then decided that maybe there wasn't a frontman after all. I guess it's the Beatles themselves had decided that long before, perhaps in 1957, as you said, that they were always going to be at least a duo, if not a band.
Yeah, they experimented with calling themselves Johnny and the Silver Beatles, Johnny and the Moondogs, sorry, at one stage, but they never saw themselves as an X and the Y's group, and it's really interesting. I mean, I think this is really kind of John. I mean, even the Quarrymen was the Quarrymen rather than Johnny. So I kind of think it was a John thing that he although he liked dominating a group, he didn't actually want to be the front man. And then Paul comes along, and then clearly, you know, he's clearly an equal talent, and then the question is, well, is it going to be Paul? And no, that's not going to work. And so, you know, but I think there's always a kind of creeping sense that one of them might step out of the front, because they're kind of being encouraged to, because that's the only model, and they're trying to get a record deal, and people are like, well, nobody knows what you are really, because, you know, we don't know. There's your group without a front man. That's a weird thing. I guess the only model they had were the girl groups, you know, the Shirelles and so on. I do think that structure was another kind of way that they were inventing their own model, you know, and they were kind of resisting being turned into because all the other acts were either solo acts, you know, because that's why they were always talking about being the next Elvis Presley, because there wasn't a next The Somethings, right? Or they were like Cliff and the Shadows, but this was something new.
Do you want to say a little bit more about the girl group influence? That's something that you pick up on in the book that I'd never realised before.
Yeah, I mean, I think they were essentially a girl group, at least for the first couple of years. I think that the influence of girl groups on them was massive and maybe slightly underrated. You know, in the first sort of 2 or 3 albums, they do a lot of girl group covers. They do a lot of covers in the Cavern and in Hamburg. So, what was it about girl groups? I mean, first of all, you know, there were lots of great songs. Second, they were very hotly emotional songs, full of jealousy and betrayal, and there's a great sense of drama to girl group songs, and I think that appealed to Lennon in particular. And thirdly, there was this great sense of camaraderie and friendship, right? Girl groups are in part about friendship, and there's always some sort of dialogue, explicit or implicit, between the singer and the other singers, and the backing singers and the kind of lead singer. And you get this sense that, you know, the girl who's singing is kind of being backed up by her friends. You also get the sense that they're talking to each other about boys, that they're talking about their emotional lives, right? And I think that appealed to John and Paul, and I think that the Beatles kind of carried that on all through their work.
Let's just talk a little bit about the eyeball-to-eyeball songs. The first hits of the Beatles, Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, obviously they had influences of both of them in there. I think Please Please Me is a great example, actually, of a John idea where that harmony line, the top line, just shows Paul McCartney is the best rock harmonizer ever. But the eyeball-to-eyeball songs that followed, the ones that actually defined Beatlemania, She Loves You, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. Can you say something about the sort of alchemy of how they worked together on those, how those came together?
Well, I mean, they were constantly in each other's company in these early years, right? And all the way through, but including in particularly 1963, when they first break through in Britain, right? But they don't go from kind of 0 to 100. They do have a #1 hit early in the year with Please Please Me, but in terms of like being these huge national figures, that doesn't really kind of come true until the end of the year. And what they're doing in 1963 is they're just on the road all the time. They're just doing gig after gig after gig after gig after gig, traveling around in their own van, or they're traveling around in a tour bus with other pop stars doing shows, traveling to TV studios, radio studios, staying in hotels all the time, and they've really only just relatively recently cottoned on to the fact, John and Paul, that if they write their songs and record their songs, they actually make a lot of money, and they have their own income stream from the publishing, right? Not so there's the group income and then there's the John and Paul income. And so every spare moment they have on the bus, in the hotel room, they get together and start writing. And the relationship, which is already very close, becomes so fluid and so sort of easy that they can just kind of, there's no effort involved really. It just kind of flows out of them as soon as they're sitting down together playing guitars. To just start messing around and things come up and ideas come up. And it's almost this kind of intuitive, unconscious process. They're kind of in the zone, as sportsmen say, right? When they're together with each other, they're hardly thinking about what they're doing. It just kind of happens, And that was a kind of way of writing and being together that only lasted really for that kind of year or two, and then it kind of becomes something else. And they something equally exciting and in some ways more exciting, but they never kind of recaptured that absolute fluidity. But that's where those songs like I Want to Hold Your Hand, She Loves You, From Me to You, that come out of that.
And one thing you draw out in the book about these kind of songs is that it's hard to tell where the melody line is, that you've got two lead lines. And that I think that's part of the sound of John and Paul singing together. It's partly the timbre of their voices, I suppose,
yeah.
But also it's the way that they wend around each other.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak for a long time about this, but because in a way, I feel like, the sound of their voices together is really the essence of the whole Beatles experience, right? I think it's absolutely at the heart of it, and then George's voice, as a threesome as well. But starting with John and Paul, and I still find it utterly astonishing and mystifying that they both had incredible voices. Because, first of all, they happen to be songwriting geniuses or musical geniuses, and they just happen to live 1.5 miles from each other. That would have been amazing enough. They didn't also have to be great singers. Do you know what I mean? That's an independent coincidence. That even now, when the Rolling Stone does the top 100 greatest rock singers all time, both John and Paul are in the kind of top 20, right? Because they both have incredible. I don't know how this happens. Anyway, and then they're also harmonising, and yes, they're influenced by the Everly Brothers, but they're also doing the things that the Everly Brothers didn't do. There's all sorts of interesting and complex harmonies going on, which they seem to work out very quickly because they're doing everything very quickly. It's one of the most kind of thrilling parts of the whole Beatles sound.
And then we get to the peak of Beatlemania, and there's a kind of Lennon dominance for a while in terms of the songwriting, in terms of the appearance on albums. But to me, it seems that this is the period when you really see Paul's influence, sort of supportive influence musically. So even if we go ahead a year or so to Ticket to Ride, you say quite a bit about. Maybe I should just let you say what you say about Ticket to Ride.
Yeah, I mean, Ticket to Ride is this huge leap forward. It's kind of a love song, but it's not. It's a strange kind of a love song, right? It's kind of a breakup song, but it's even a strange breakup song. And it's a John song, and it's definitely got Lennon's kind of ability to communicate something very weird but very moving at the same time, where you feel like he is upset about this girl leaving but kind of resigned to it at the same time. It's quite a complex kind of emotion, right? But it's a Paul production, because it's Paul who suggests that kind of broken drum beat, which kind of feels like it's dragging the song back, gives it that strange kind of like half movement. And Paul who gives it this big booming kind of bass sound as well. And so you get this huge, immense kind of airy, marshy kind of sound. And it just feels like, I don't know, you can see all these different influences. You can hear some girl group influence in there. You can hear Martha and the Vandellas. You can hear Dancing in the Streets in there. I just think it's the first kind of great masterpiece, and it's a real. I think it's a Paul song as much as a John song, even though it's kind of recognised as a Lennon song.
And another great example of the inventiveness of Paul's harmony. I think those fourths on the main beat are unexpected. They sound a bit harsh, but
they're incredible. Yeah.
Okay, so again, just looking at the time and sort of moving along, I did want, if we can, you to say a little bit about We Can Work It Out, which comes with the next period, as being one of those songs that reflects the relationship between the two of them. Yeah. There are others you mentioned as well, and feel free to be thematic here and take other examples as well.
Yeah, so I talked about that early period when they're very this kind of early fluid, very effortless kind of 50-50 eyeball to eyeball, whatever you want to call it, that period. And then they start to kind of move apart, partly because they literally move apart, right? So Lennon moves out to the suburbs of London, to Kenwood, and so do Ringo and George. They all kind of live near each other. And Paul, and this is quite a sort of point of tension, and they have to talk about whether or not this is going to work or not. Paul decides to stay in London, in central London, right, living in Jane Asher's house in Wimpole Street. And therefore, the songwriting partnership changes. It becomes more of a work thing, right? Not just a natural, we're just sitting with guitars here. It's like we have to make an appointment to write songs together, and then we need to get some songs done on Thursday. It's almost, it's become professionalised a little bit, which Lennon was a bit, unhappy about later. He said, it got false around this point. It might have got false, but it also starts to get incredibly interesting. Like there's all sorts of, there's very creative tensions that are going on. And I think one of the things that happens, therefore, is that they start developing different independent artistic musical sensibilities around this time, and you can see it in their own songs. They start to become, in their kind of independent songs, they start to become more kind of themselves. McCartney starts expressing himself with a greater kind of musical range. Lennon starts doing really kind of more radical and stranger things. And they're also kind of exploring each other's personality in music, right? So Paul McCartney's bouncing around London, always on the go, always kind of going to see people, going to see gigs, is going to kind of avant-garde happenings and so on. He loves the social life of London. Lennon likes just kind of lying on his sofa and watching TV in Surrey, and around this stage is starting has taken LSD and is smoking marijuana. And you have these kind of two personality archetypes, really. One which is like, we all got to go, this is about drive and energy and dynamism. And one which is like, yeah, I can just lie here and just think about things. And you can see them starting to develop those sensibilities in the songs. So We Can Work It Out. The verse is Paul, and it's so Paul. Basically, he's saying, it seems to be a song about let's work out an argument and reconcile each. But it's not really. It's like, you've got to agree with me, otherwise this relationship is going to end. We could talk about this all night, or we could say good night, right? But basically, it's this driving kind of like, and you can hear this kind of fast, this kind of groove in the music, and then there's this beautiful middle eight. And this is one of the most kind of perfect juxtapositions of a John and Paul, Paul verse and a John middle eight, where John comes in and says, oh, hey, life's very short. There's no time for fussing and fighting. And he's much more chilled. It's almost like he's kind of like rising up above all the kind of hustle and bustle that Paul kind of conveys in the verse and says, hey, come on. And I just think it's a 2-minute pop song, but there's so much there. There's so much about like what it means to kind of live a fulfilling life. You know, is it about rushing around, always doing things, or is it about just saying, hey, you know, let's take it more of a wider perspective on this. So yeah, I think it, and I think you then see them in the subsequent couple of years really pushing those personalities out. You can see it in Strawberry Fields versus Penny Lane. You can see it in A Day in the Life, you know, and then they then take those two sensibilities and just kind of smash them together. And so, yeah, that's yeah.
I'm glad you've brought us to Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, because that's got through the second disc of the Blue album, and we're now moving on to the Red album. For those of you who, like me, first encountered the Beatles through those big compilation albums that were released in the 70s. Although the time before you start asking questions is down to 8 minutes now, so I need to be fairly quick with the rest of the things. You mentioned Revolver, which I perhaps is my favourite album, I think. The difference between Lennon's laid-back approach coming through in I'm Only Sleeping, and then the diversity of McCartney's different approaches there.
Yeah.
Do you want to say a little bit about that? That's not a question, that's an invitation.
Yeah, I mean, so I think what you're seeing is from 1965 to 1966. Maybe we should go back a bit to Yesterday.
Okay.
Just as a kind of pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Because Yesterday is a point at which I think McCartney starts to realise the full majesty of his own talents. I mean, this is a song that comes to him, you know, in his sleep, or when he wakes up from sleep, and he can't believe he's written it. Right, so he goes round to John, to George Martin, to person after person, like several people, and plays them this song and says, this is somebody's song, right? I didn't write this, right? This must have come from somewhere. And then like, no, haven't heard it. It's like, and then finally he's like, wow, okay, maybe I can write really good songs. He sings it himself. He records it on the same day that he records I've Just Seen a Face with a group and I'm Down with a group. So a country kind of style, folksy rocker, a bluesy screaming I'm Down, and Yesterday, 3 songs in one day, wildly different styles. It's completely crazy. And you're starting to see, and I think McCartney's starting to see, and John can see, the full kind of incredible range that wasn't really evident in those kind of early albums, where he's got some amazing big rock and roll songs and some lovely ballads, but it's only in 1965 that he starts to take off. Yesterday is just Paul singing. It's very uncomfortable for the others, especially John. There's nobody else on that record. It's not a rock and roll record at all. It seems to come from another genre altogether. When they're on stage, the others literally go off stage and Paul stands at the front under a spotlight by himself, right? This starts to trigger John's insecurities. John was always worried about things like this and is always worried about people leaving him. And I think if you understand his childhood, you understand why. And I think around this stage, he starts to think maybe Paul could leave the group. And reasonably enough, you know, being a solo star was still kind of the major thing for pop stars to do. And I think it eats away. You see John kind of return to Yesterday in interviews time and time again. And he used to make snide jokes about it with Paul. When he wrote Imagine, he played it at the piano for one of his friends, and he said, what do you think? And his friend said, it's amazing. And John said, yeah. Is it as good as Yesterday? So I think post Yesterday, you start to see them really bloom. I mean, because John responds to Yesterday with In My Life. I mean, so because that's a bit later in the year. I think he's already thinking, right, we've got to go big here. But by the kind of Revolver era, you're seeing them both, like, you know, with all guns blazing. You're seeing McCartney do that incredible range thing where he's got all these different genres at command, and he can do all these different vocal styles. He can play in all sorts of, he's drawing on all these kind of different musical styles and genres. And you can see Lennon taking these immense, strange, bizarre leaps that McCartney just wouldn't do. You know, coming up with a song if it seems inadequate to describe Tomorrow Never Knows. You know, this idea, this soundscape, this avant-garde happening, right? And so you can see them both kind of like pushing out for the outer reaches of their musical and personalities.
An interesting aspect of that period, the second album, the second disc of the Blue album, is that Paul, for Yesterday, rebelled against the idea of a string section, but when a string quartet was suggested, he thought that was cool. But then if you look at the next period, probably the most schmaltzy song they did, at least before Goodnight, was Michelle. But Lennon was a collaborator in that. He seemed to embrace the sort of schmaltziness of that, whereas, well...
Yeah, I mean, and Michelle... I think Michelle's a really gorgeous song, actually. But Lennon, the bit Lennon contributed to that was "I love you, I love you, I love you," which is a real, does lift the song because it gives this really heartfelt. It's not just being pretty at that stage, and it becomes something kind of adds a level of yearning and sort of emotional truth to it. But the thing about Lennon is that he pretended he didn't like this granny music kind of style. He pretended he didn't like the non-rock and roll stuff and the references to older kind of forms of music. But he did. He loved that. He loved that song. You can hear it. You mentioned Goodnight. I mean, Goodnight is the most sentimental song they ever did, and the most kind of Disney-esque, the most pre-rock and roll era song, really, that they did. But that was an ongoing tension, I think, where John didn't really want to admit that he did really love those songs, but he had a kind of soft centre, and now and again he would let that show.
To get back to Revolver, part of the diversity that Paul demonstrated on that was Here, There and Everywhere, which of course they all sang on, and beautiful harmonies, and is noted for being one of the few times when John gave an encouraging word.
Yes, yeah. I mean, so Paul tells a story about John saying that was a good one, and in a kind of slightly gruff way. There's one or two other instances of John being nice about Paul's songs. I mean, he loved Hey Jude, and seemed to be pretty open about that. I'm a little, as you know, having read the book, I'm a little bit sceptical almost about the way Paul talks about this. So he talks now in interviews about how John never liked to admit his soft side and didn't like to open up and say, I really love you. And particularly, never complimented Paul, never said, that's an amazing song, or did very rarely, which is why he remembered the odd nice word about Here, There and Everywhere or whatever. And I believe him, but at the same time, it's funny that Paul doesn't even volunteer any instances of where he told John he thought he was great. I mean, and there's I can find no record of Paul ever doing that either. So I kind of think, well, Paul, what were you doing? Maybe this was a problem for both of you.
Okay, so because I will come to you first because I saw your hand first, but before we do that, I just want to give you some cues as to things you might want to ask about because they're on my list here and I never got to them. So never got to talking about drugs, talking about the effect of Epstein's death, India, Magical Mystery Tour,
or the
sort
70s.
of dominance of McCartney in the latter part. What did Yoko do? What's the influence of Yoko? The effect of the Get It Be film or the documentary, the series of films on what we know and what we understand about the Beatles. Well, that's enough. You've got your own questions, I'm sure, without me suggesting more prompts. So, yes, could you wait until the microphone arrives, please? And then go ahead with your question.
So I think I sort of missed the majority of the Beatles era, being that I was born in 1999. But I was quite excited when they finally released their final song, Now and Then, because it meant that I could actually say that I was in fact born in the Beatles era, because they're still releasing music. But I wondered what your thoughts were on it as a final sort of release, and what your opinion was as looking, because I felt that it was quite different from a lot of their music, and looking back, do you think it's a good sort of note to end on for them?
I mean, I don't have strong feelings about it. I think it's quite a nice tune and quite tastefully produced. You know, I'm glad that it puts you squarely in the Beatles era. That's nice. I like that. I think it's interesting from a kind of the story of it point of view. I think it's interesting that Paul really wanted to do it. Spent quite a few years on and off, like working on this song. He was very determined to do this, basically, right? To take this scrap of a recording and turn it into a Beatles record, which required a lot of effort and commitment and resources. And it does suggest to me that he felt a personal connection to it. And that when John says, "Now and then I miss you," you know, in the middle of the 70s when they weren't seeing each other much, that he thinks it was about him. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, please. Same again, please. Just wait for the mic. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much for that. I'm just looking at the title of your book, A Love Story, and I'm thinking about if you ever listened to the two of them, the harmonies without any music. Their voices intertwine in this very intimate fashion that reminds me a bit of Graham Parsons and Emmylou Harris, yeah. And I just wondered about that intimacy, though. It makes me speculate about what their emotional life together was. I'd just be interested to hear what your views about that is.
If you want speculation on their emotional life, then I recommend 300 pages or whatever it is. It's all there. But yeah, no, I mean, I mean, that really is what the book is about. You can absolutely hear it in the harmonising in the book, and that's why I say, like, the sound of their voices together is kind of at the heart of the music and the story, really, and the metaphors. It's not really a metaphor; it's just kind of true. And also the counterpoint thing, the way that they're both singing different melodies, but they both fit together. That's just an perfect metaphor for the relationship and the whole story.
I think when you see video and they're both at the same mic and you see them singing together, you feel something of what you're talking about, I think. I mentioned we corresponded by email beforehand, and the frontispiece, you won't be able to see it from here, but it's just the two of them sitting on a railing. I think it's between shots in, was it a documentary or something?
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
I think it's 1965, but they look like teenagers. They look like little kids.
Do.
It's a very sweet picture.
It is. It's a sweet kind of picture, and you see that. You mentioned actually that fans have collected pictures of them looking at each other.
Oh God! I mean, some of you will know about the McLennan community, which thrives on Tumblr and now TikTok, and it's mainly American teenage girls. So it overlaps with the Swifties. It's a kind of subculture where the whole theme is the love between John and Paul, and so some of them collect long strings of photos of them just looking at each other lovingly, and I'm into it.
More questions? If you don't ask, there'll be more from me. So, if we could go to the back, please, first. I won't forget you. You are allowed to. Yeah, well, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I just wondered if you'd had any feedback from Paul at all, or any contacts with Paul about your book.
No, I haven't. I wouldn't expect to, at least not directly. Maybe we'll hear from in some oblique way from his people at some point. But I wouldn't expect it to. I think if you're him, it's probably just kind of a drag, as he would say. I get the sense that when he reads Beatles books, he's like, and he just is full of people guessing what he was doing and thinking and feeling. And even though I think my guesses are actually better than his at this stage, from his point of view, that's probably quite annoying.
It probably is good to expand on that, because you chose not to go after interviews.
Yeah.
And maybe just say a little bit about your decisions regarding sources. Yeah,
I mean, I don't. It's not one of those books where I've interviewed 1,000 people and then kind of written down what they said. It's a bit of a dismissive way to talk about it. But that's not, that wasn't really my approach. My approach was, there's a huge amount of interviews done already, and many of them repeat the same material. And if you go and interview people now, they just say the same stuff that they did. And also, they're now kind of 50, 60 years from the events. So actually, it was more fruitful for me, and this is really just my take, I'm not pretending to be the definitive historian of the Beatles. It was more fruitful for me to look at what they were doing and saying nearer the time, as close as possible to the time, not always, but, you know, and then kind of try and work out what was happening. Because, you know, memory is a funny thing, and so one of the problems with some Beatles literature and some Beatles books is that they take these interviews too literally. You know, Lennon's interviews were just full of inaccuracies and bullshit, frankly. I mean, he was always entertaining and always funny, but he was taken way too literally by way too many writers. And now if you look back, they're full of inaccuracies and stuff that he's just making up, some of which he admitted later on, but people still kind of forgot that he'd already contradicted himself. So it's all a bit of a mess, and I think you have to kind of go back and unpick some of that stuff.
So, yes, sir, please. The microphone's on its way.
You said one of your inspirations for writing this book was you thought McCartney's musical talents had been underrated. What's your favourite McCartney song?
Well, gosh. Well, no, thanks for asking that impossible question. I mean, the one that comes to mind right now is Blackbird. Okay, good. I'm glad you think so. And what could I say about it that's possibly interesting, apart from it's amazing? I think it's typically McCartney, and it sounds like it's been around forever. You cannot imagine it not existing. It just seems to be drawn from this kind of deep well of music. He seems to be kind of able to access this some ancient kind of like reservoir of all the music, and just goes down to it and pulls it out from the well. And it's also very McCartney-esque in that it sort of sounds a bit like a genre, but not quite. So it's kind of English folky, but it's not really that folky. It's got other kind of influences. It's got a bit of Bach in it. It's got a little bit of blues. And McCartney had this kind of way of not really being an expert in any one genre, but kind of like listening to it a little bit and getting a kind of hazy feel for it, and then making it his own. Do you see what I mean? So that the songs always echo with other kind of musicians and other artists and other genres and traditions without settling in any one of them. In the end, they just sound like itself. It sounds like itself. And Blackbird just sounds like itself, and it could have never been anything else but Blackbird.
And also, some amazing covers. It's become a jazz standard.
Yeah.
Other artists have been drawn.
Because, yeah, and when you get a song which has this incredible kind of bone structure that you know, other artists kind of build things on top of it.
And favourite Lennon song?
Well, gosh, I'm going to have to. I mean, maybe Strawberry Fields Forever, but that's too obvious. I mean, I do think that the. Oh well, no, I know. I think my favourite Lennon song. Although I think the reason I love this song is because it's a Beatles song, in the fullest sense. But I do love "Come Together," and I think "Come Together" actually might be my favourite Beatles song. And it sounds like the first song of the '70s. You know, not the last song of the '60s. It feels very modern. It's got this amazing sound. And it's got Lennon's incredible way of writing what seem like nonsense lyrics, but it's incredibly difficult to write like that. The kind of the rhythms of the words and the way they're kind of never quite make sense, but they're incredibly suggestive at the same time. And there's a sense of menace to it as well. So it's this big kind of like, it could be just a song about coming together, and which sounds quite kind of hippie-ish and kind of like, hey, let's all just come together. But there's a kind of darkness to it and a kind of dark menace and weirdness to it, which is very kind of Lennon-y. And also by this stage, they've all got so good at their instruments, to state the obvious. They're all really good, and it's just an incredible ensemble performance. The group are all playing so well and so tightly and so together, right at the moment that personally they're coming apart. So the more they're arguing and the more intense that gets, the better they get at playing together. And they make the best music right at the end of their career as a group. I don't think there's any other group you'd say that of.
I said I'd come back to you. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, could we come right down to the front, please? Lady on the front row, and then we'll come to the gentleman behind. And then we'll come to you, sir.
I will be probably very controversial. On the one hand, Blackbird is probably my very favoritist of favorite songs. On the other hand, I went to Paul McCartney's concert in New York about 10 years ago. And since you are saying that he is the genius and he takes his ideas from the well of blah, blah, what was interesting was that it was okay until he started singing the old Beatles songs. So I think there must have been some sort of magic between him and Lennon that, of course, they would have their original ideas, but I think that the collaboration made it somehow more special.
Yeah, I know, totally. Would not argue with that, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I expected you to be sort of specific and be saying you are wrong or
So-
he is a genius.
No, I mean,
No.
that's hence
Okay.
the Beatles, really.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
Okay, sorry about that.
it's all right. No, I agree with you.
And then the gentleman behind, please, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes, the Beatles songs have a lot of meaning to a lot of their stuff, don't they? And very deep, aren't they? Even Penny Lane it's about a lane in Liverpool, you know, sort of just a penny. You know, it's all about class and everything, all hidden, isn't it? And also they did lots of mixture in their music. Like, for example, there was a hotel in Canada which they sort of put into one of their singles, sort of the background noises of the hotel of one of their singles.
Yes. What's the question?
Well, it's just a sort of statement, really.
Can't remember. It's all right.
McCartney's released a classical just recently, hasn't he? But he did a bit of classical into his pop music as well.
Yeah. No, he's constantly exploring and experimental. That's right. Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah.
So the gentleman just two tiers down from the back, and then we'll come to you.
The lady at the front slightly stole my question. I was going to say that I saw McCartney in his Back in the World tour in 28, I think it was, in Manchester, and I thought he was absolutely amazing. I find that he's an ordinary bloke, but he's also a genius as well. And the kind of responses to the It's a Drag to Lennon's death is that kind of ordinary, matter-of-fact bloke. There are two McCartneys, really. I remember he gave lots of anecdotes, and it explained a lot of the meanings of Penny Lane and all of that stuff. He told lots of things about George and John and Ringo. My question was, though, in that evening in 28, he was absolutely fantastic, playing the Beatles stuff, playing the Wings stuff. But after that, I can't think of a single song. I've bought McCartney albums, but I can't think of a single memorable song that I'd want to hear post-Wings. Not really. Did he need those collaborations? Did he need Linda, Denny, John, the Beatles to find that magic? So underrated.
Yeah, I mean, I just sort of disagree, really. But I mean, I do think that what he was doing in the Beatles with John is just on a different level to. But I mean, it's on a different level to absolutely everyone else in music. So I don't. That's not a criticism of his post-Beatles career. As for his post-Beatles career, oh no, I mean, I just think there's so much great stuff all the way through, right up to the last sort of 10 years. But if you look on the original piece I did about McCartney is called 64 Reasons to Celebrate Paul McCartney, I think. There's a link to a playlist I put together of all his post-Beatles gems that I think are underrated. So have a listen to that and see if you still agree.
Could we come down to the front row, please? Yes, okay. If you could bring the mic over, that's great. Thank you. The lady next to the end. One from the end. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm actually going to add a little bit to my question, this gentleman here. But what I was wondering was, you haven't actually mentioned George and Ringo, and yet the interaction and relationship that Paul and George had with them must have affected their own relationship with each other. And if I include Epstein as well, you haven't really said anything at all about him and how he affected their own relationship with each other.
Yeah, I mean, only because we don't have time. But George and Ringo, obviously indispensable to the music and also to the chemistry of all four of them. George, I think, I don't think anyone but George could have lived in a group with Lennon and McCartney for so long, because it would have been impossible. They were domineering personalities, both of them, really. They were always talking, they were always kind of joshing, and they were obviously incredibly confident in themselves, and they were also just genuine, amazing at what they were doing. So it would have been quite punishing for a less strong kind of personality. But George had a very, very, out of all of them, I think, really the strongest kind of inner confidence. And so he was able to cope with that. He also had this very dry, laconic wit, so he was able to cut them off at the knees when he needed to. And he was a bit annoyed by the way they became the kind of focal point of the group, particularly after they start writing songs together, right? And they start earning much more money than George and Ringo. And then they start becoming celebrated as the greatest songwriters of the century, And so I think he again, a lesser person would have crumpled. George just comes back stronger and starts writing, getting better and better at writing his own songs. And then also there's this incredible creative thing of bringing in Indian music and Indian ideas and philosophy to the group, which is hugely important to the group's creative development. I think that's an incredibly creative response to marginalisation, So I think, and as for Ringo, we talk about Indian philosophy. I think Ringo is the most naturally kind of Zen member of the Beatles, the one whose ego has dissolved in the surface of the greater good. And I can't say enough about what an amazing drummer he was. And again, his drumming is in the same sense in that his drumming is not about him as a drummer. His drumming is always about his in service to the song. So he always creates the best drumming sound and the best drum beats for the song. Yes, I love them both, but it is called John and Paul. So.
Yes, so could we go to the gentleman on the next to back row in the maroon and yellow?
It's not a question per se, it's just to say there is one Harrison-Lennon compilation that I know of called Cry for a Shadow, which is a very early instrumental, which is actually very good. We have a go at it with our band, but there isn't much of it. I think that might be the only collaboration between Harrison and Lennon.
And again, is it any more of a collaboration that... I actually think there are lots of Harrison-Lennon and Harrison-McCartney collaborations, but Harrison just never gets the credit,
Well, that's a credited one.
Yeah, She Said is possibly a Lennon and Harrison collaboration that's credited to Lennon and McCartney. Yes.
Hello, I'm back again. You did mention wanting sort of questions on drugs, and as a current university student, that's what I'm here for. So how much do you think the descent into his interest in LSD and that sort of era affected the music? And would we really have had the sort of later Beatles sounds that make them so iconic without that sort of foray into the world of drugs?
Oh, yeah, no, I don't think we would. I do think that the drugs had a positive influence on the development of the Beatles' music and therefore Western culture. So, yeah, no, I think that marijuana first and then LSD they worked. I think marijuana was very useful for them because they started getting into it as they were like conquering America and the world, 1964. So the whole world is now kind of pressing in on them. And, well, Ringo tells this nice story where he says, what would happen is we'd be at a reception after a gig and there'd be like all the most powerful and influential and rich people in the country, and everyone would be wondering where we were because we would be in the bathroom with a joint. And I think it's emblematic of what was happening, like the fame pressed them even closer together. It might have gone the other way, but actually marijuana was another way for them to get on their own wavelength and exclude out, to feel like they were different from the rest of the world, in a bubble from, and then LSD is just important, as I'm sure you all know, particularly for Lennon and Harrison. And then Paul kind of starts dabbling in it as well. It also influences Paul. You can hear some sort of LSD influence ideas on Penny Lane. Yeah, so Penny Lane, Strawberry Fields, and Sgt. Pepper is the height of the kind of LSD influence. Although, as I say, I think you can already hear it early on in We Can Work It Out, that sense that I'm just kind of like, floating above everything and can see the greater picture here from John, I think is sort of starts with LSD.
Well, I see that we're out of time, so it's my job to bring things to a close. This is the book. It's available outside, and Ian will be staying around to sign copies if people would like their copies signed. I think it's been great to get some insights this evening from Ian. Would you join me in thanking him for a really successful